you ever have a situation where the alternator seems to be working good, but you just can't keep that battery charged up? Whoa, that's coming right up. Well, we're at the 2017 Vision Conference in Overland Park, Kansas, and with me is Bobby Bassett, and he's with Gates, and this guy is just a wealth of knowledge. And you know what, Bobby, I found out something really interesting, that this tensioner here seems to be part of the problem that we're having with keeping our batteries charged up and that sort of thing. Tell us more about that.
Well, Jim, I'd like to start off just a little bit, if I could, and show you some of what I call the hard numbers today. And these are percentages that we work with manufacturers on. And what this is telling us is when we look at these numbers, this is typically after the technician installs something. If there's a failure, that's what this represents. And and when we talk about a tensioner today, or even a belt replacement, Jim, these are numbers to think about. 40% of returned batteries. This is when you buy a battery, you install it, and it doesn't hold the charge when it goes back to the factory. Up to 40% of the time, all it needed was charging. Think about that just for a minute. Let's add that to this next one right here. 70% of return rotating electrical, or the alternator. This is after the technician installs it. If it doesn't charge correctly, then it goes back to the jobber who gives them a new, and eventually it goes back to the factory. This number actually runs from about 40% to 70% of the time. When they test them at the factory, there's nothing wrong with them. They charge just great. So think about those two numbers. A high percentage of batteries that are being returned, they just needed charging. A high percent of the alternators that get returned, they're not. And the reason is the belt's not able to transfer the power. Think about this today. Today we have high mileage vehicles, 10 to 12 years old, around 120,000 miles on it. Preventive maintenance for the most part has been ignored. So it's no longer just a individual components challenge, it's a systems issue. And that's why our new motto is Be System Smart, or I-60 R90. Inspect at 60,000, reinspect or replace at 90,000, because that's really the guideline for us today.
Okay, so that's a pretty important figures right there. Inspect at 60,000, replace at 90,000. Of course, you're talking about belt, tensioner together as a pair, I would assume?
Absolutely. Actually, belts and tensioners were manufactured as a system, and they were designed to be replaced together. But because most technicians view this as a hard part, they're not even checked until they fall apart.
Yeah, okay, so let's take a look at a quick little animation that Bobby's put together, and you can see what he's talking about. And during this piece of animation that we can see right now, Bobby, we see that the tensioner has lost its tension, and we can see the belt spinning, but the alternator's pulley is not quite keeping up, and you can see how hard it is for it to charge the battery, and that voltage needle goes down, down, down. All right, and so back away from that now, this is what you were talking about, and this little demonstration, or this little thing you got right here, is our tensioner, keeping tension on the belt, and there's that alternator pulley we were just looking at.
Think about, the belt only has one job today, and that's to transfer the torque from the crank, Jim, to all of the accessories. And it does that by wedging the pulley ribs down into the belt ribs down into the pulley grooves. Well, the tensioner is what maintains the correct amount of tension on the belt at all times. It serves two purposes. Number one, it maintains that correct amount of tension on the belt throughout its duty cycle. It's a balancing force. As each accessory turns on and off, it's got to balance that load. Over a period of time, that spring will begin to diminish. The second thing it does is that it dampens. It dampens each cylinder as it's firing. It's sending torsional vibration down through that belt. Something's got to remove it, and it's the damper within the system. And if we don't remove that, if you've ever seen your vehicle running or your customer's vehicle running and that tensioner arm is bouncing, as you stated, the animation, what it's telling us is that the damper has failed and it's got to be replaced.
Absolutely. And if it doesn't get replaced and that belt starts to slap, it starts to tear up the next thing in line, in this case, this right here, and it starts to beat up on that device, which happens to be a power steering pump right here. But it could be anything in the system.
Absolutely.
All right.
Hey, I've got a cutaway of a tensioner right here. Now, if you look at it from this side, this is what the tensioner looks like, and of course it had a pulley on it. But we simply sawed this in half. And one way to check a tensioner to see if it is performing correctly. Now, the one very difficult thing for me to tell you, Jim, is does it have the correct spring tension? Each spring tension is proprietary. There's no universal type tensioner. So based on the application, the spring tension can be different.
That's a good point. So we don't need to worry about measuring like with a pull test or something like that, because that doesn't really tell us anything. Like Bobby said, the spring tension is application specific.
That's it. And the main thing to remember is that the belt and tensioner are designed as a system and should be replaced. Because if this belt today, the newer EPDM belts can run well over 100,000 miles. And so the way we need to check those today is with the belt wear tool. Okay. But the thing we need to remember is if the customer comes in and we replace just the belt, and we don't replace the tensioner, this belt has the capability of running another 100,000 miles. The tensioner's already met its design cycle. See, and so the question is, can it go another 100,000 miles? It can't. No. At some point, they're coming back for failure.
Right, and that's a very, very good point. So those are things, something that's important to remember. We can't just replace belts anymore on modern automobiles because the tensioner and the belt, is a pair. And sometimes the do-it-yourselfer, the automotive enthusiast, I like to call these folks, and some of them are just great working around the vehicle, but they don't know things like this. And they may come to your shop and say, well, I've changed my belt and I've got an alternator and I just can't keep that battery charged up. You need to laser focus probably on that tensioner, huh?
Absolutely. And I just wanted to show you, this is simply a cutaway of the inside of this tensioner. And of course we have springs, so this is the spring that maintains the correct amount of tension. But this white piece that you see here, that's the damper. Remember I talked about dampening. Yeah. Something's got to remove all that torsional vibration as each cylinder fires, and that's the job of this small piece here. And when this is like a brake shoe inside of a brake drum, and when that brake shoe wears out, then it allows that arm to begin to hammer like that.
Right, and we get that bouncing.
The bouncing. So when you see that tensioner bouncing, the damper has already begun to wear out. We've got to replace it because, like Jim said, now I'm hammering the other accessories to death as well.
Absolutely. Well, I don't know about you guys, but I just learned a ton about tensioners and belts and things like that lately. Now I have a better idea of why some of those batteries get returned and some of those alternators I hear about to get returned. They're just not doing their job. They can't because the belt's not transferring the power because the tensioners are wearing out. They're just not getting replaced. So think about that when you run into these situations, and look back at this video from time to time, and it's going to get you out of a bind a whole lot of times.